In 2023, French companies lost major infrastructure, mining, and energy contracts in Africa worth billions of dollars. In this same period, Chinese firms signed deals across the continent of Africa valued at over $170 billion. This is according to the China-Africa Research Initiative, so I'm not making up this figure myself. Turkey increased its trade with Africa from $5 billion in 2023 to over $40 billion by 2022. Russia, despite sanctions elsewhere, expanded security and mining agreements in more than 20 African countries. This didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen overnight either. For decades, France was Africa's default business partner in many regions. Yet today, governments that once relied almost entirely on Paris have signed contracts in Beijing, Ankara, and Moscow instead of France. The big question is, what changed? Why are African leaders choosing partners that were barely present 30 years ago over France? Is France losing contract because it failed Africa, or because Africa changed? And does this shift actually benefit ordinary Africans or just new foreign players? That's the question a lot of people have been asking, and in this video, we will break down what is really happening using facts, timeline, and real country example. We will explain who is winning, who is losing, and why this moment matters far beyond Africa. And before we begin, if you like content that explain Africa geopolitics from an African point of view, consider subscribing and giving this video a like. It actually costs you nothing to do so. To understand why French companies are losing contracts today, we first need to understand how they became so dominant in the first place in Africa. This story starts after African countries gained independence, mostly in the 1960s. So, political independence came very quickly, but economic independence did not. So, many new governments lacked engineers, capitals, and large companies that could build roads, power plants, ports, or railways. France stepped in to fill this gap naturally. So, French firms already knew the terrain, they spoke the language, they understood the legal system because those systems were copied from France itself. So in many countries, French advisors stayed inside ministry long after independence. So as a result, when a government needed a highway, a port upgrade, or a telecom network, the phone often went to Paris by default. You understand? So there was also money. French banks and development agencies provided loans that were tied to French contractors. This meant if a country borrowed money from France, it usually had to hire a French company to do the work as well. Over time, this created a closed loop. French companies built the infrastructure, they earned the profit, and reinforced their position. Another factor was currency. 14 African countries still uses the CFA francs, a currency linked to the euro and guaranteed by the French treasury. While the system brought stability, it also kept strong financial ties with France. French companies found it easier to operate in CFA countries than firms from Asia or Eastern Europe, so that gave them an added advantage for decades. By the 1990s and early 2000s, French firms dominated key sectors in West and Central Africa. Companies like Bolloré controlled ports, logistics, Total Energies played a major role in oil and gas, while Orange led telecommunications. So this dominance became normal. Contracts were renewed again and again, often without competition. But here is a key point. It worked when African governments had little bargaining power. So as the world changed, that old setup started to feel outdated. The very thing that once made France strong in Africa, which was its history, slowly became a weakness to them. As African economies grew and population became younger and more connected, leaders started facing new pressure. Citizens wanted jobs, electricity, transport, and visible development, not promises that took 10 years to deliver. The government began reviewing old contracts and asking whether they were still getting good values from this contract. So many officials felt French companies were too comfortable. So projects moved slowly, costs were high, and negotiations were at the same time complicated. So in some cases, government felt they were treated more like junior partner than equals. So profit often went back to Europe while local businesses remained sidelined. At the same time, Africa's bargaining power increased. By 2020, Africa's population passed over 1.3 billion people, and its cities were expanding very, very fast. So infrastructure demand exploded. Road, power stations, housing, and the internet network were urgently needed. Governments realized they were no longer begging for partners. Partners were competing for access to Africa's huge markets. So what a blessing to the continent. So this is where expectations change. Africa leaders wanted faster delivery. They wanted fewer political lectures tied to business deals. French companies, banned by European regulations and caution financing rules, struggled to adapt quickly. Public opinion mattered more than before. Social media amplified criticism of foreign influence. Protests against France in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger Republic, reflected deeper frustration, not just politics this time around. Even when French company had technical expertise, choosing it could trigger public backlash. Leaders have to think about optics, not just engineering.
And the Belt and Road Initiative between Kenya and China has seen billions of dollars invested in a number of infrastructure projects.
Meanwhile, African policymakers were comparing notes. They saw neighboring countries getting infrastructure built faster with non-French partners. They noticed costs elsewhere were a kind of very cheaper than what France was offering there. So this comparison created pressure. If another country could get a highway in 3 years, why should we wait for 7 years? By the time France started adjusting its approach, many governments had already decided to diversify. So that wasn't about cutting ties completely, it was about reducing dependence. And as alternative appeared, loyalty alone was no longer enough to win contracts. China entered Africa at the right moment. While France was still operating under old assumptions, China approached Africa as a fast-growing market with urgent need. Chinese asked simple questions. What do you want us to build for you? When do you want it finished? That is simple. So Chinese companies offer something which French company could not, which is a full package. So Chinese firms, they did the financing, the construction, the equipment, and most of the time, even the labor was bundled. So according to China Africa Research Initiative, Chinese financed and built over 10,000 kilometers of railways and 100,000 kilometers of road in Africa between the year 2000 and 2020. So speed was the real attraction. Projects that take years to approve under European system move very fastly in months under China's. Leaders facing elections or public pressure found this very, very appealing since they now have, something visible or a very visible project to campaign with. So costs also plays a role. Chinese firms could underbid European competitors. Lower labor costs, state-backed financing, and large-scale manufacturing gave them an edge over France. For government with limited budget, choosing a cheaper offer felt practical, even if concerns about debt existed. Another difference was attitude. China rarely commented publicly on Africa politics. No lectures about, governance during contract talks. This approach appeared to leaders who wanted development without public criticism. So that does not mean Chinese projects are perfect. No, they are not. Some face debt issues, some faced quality issues. Debt sustainability became a concern in countries like Zambia. But from the perspective of many African governments, China delivered when others delayed. Once Chinese companies proved they could build fast and at scale, the door opened wider for them. French firms used to be the default option suddenly found themselves, competing and often losing in open bid. For a long time, French companies benefited from their reputation. They were seen as experienced, reliable, and technically strong. But as African need grows, reputation alone was no longer enough. Governments were facing urgent problem, which was power shortage, traffic congestion, housing deficit, and rising unemployment. So these were not issues that could wait. Cost became central. French companies operate under European labor laws, environmental rules, and insurance requirements. So these protections are very important, but they increase expenses. A power plant or highway built by a French firm often came with a higher price tag and a longer timeline. For countries with tight budget, this created real pressure. Now compare that with new competitors. Chinese and Turkey companies often submitted bids that were 30 to 40% cheaper. They also promised faster completion. In countries where re-election happen every 4 or 5 years, speed matters a whole lot. A project finished during a leader term brings political credit. A project delayed brings a whole lot of criticism to the leader. So if you're a leader and a project was finished your tenure, you will receive praise and applaud for that. So there was also the issue of financing. French-backed loans often involve long approval processes and strict condition attached. So Chinese-backed, on the other hand, frequently release funds quickly once agreements were signed, so they don't delay with funds. So African governments began comparing outcomes instead of histories. A road that opened in 2 years instead of 6 changes trade, transport, and daily life immediately. So even if long-term durability is debated, short-term impact carries a whole lot of weight. So this shift wasn't emotional, it was practical. So ministries of defense, started asking tougher questions. Why pay more when alternative exist elsewhere? As competition increased, French firms lost their pricing advantage. Immediately that happened, it weakened their dominance rapidly. Turkey rise in Africa followed a different path. Unlike China, it did not arrive with massive loans or mega railways. Instead, it focused on visibility and relationship. Turkish leaders visited Africa more than 50 times between 2008 and 2022. Embassies multiplied and their trade office followed as well. So Turkish airline became a quiet but powerful tool in Africa. So by 2023, it flew to more African countries than any other airlines in the world. So Turkish construction company focused on projects people could see and use daily. Airport in Senegal and Niger, hospital in Somalia, housing project in Ghana. These were not abstract investment, they touched everyday life. So many African officials describe Turkish firms as flexible. They negotiated faster, they adjusted designs, they hired local laborers more often. While French companies at times arrived with fixed procedures, Turkish contractors adapted on the ground. That growth didn't come from speeches, it came from presence. Politically, Turkey avoided lecturing African governments. It framed itself as a fellow developing country that had risen through industrial growth. So that message resonated, especially with younger African leaders. Over time, Turkey became seen as a partner, not a former ruler or a distant superpower. So that perception helped Turkish contractors to win contracts easily. Russia's role in Africa is often misunderstood. It did not begin with road or power plant. It began with security. Several African countries faced armed groups, unstable borders, or political unrest. France and Western partners sometimes tied security support to political conditions. Russia did not. Russia offered military trainings, weapons, and security assistance with fewer public demand. Countries like Mali and the Central African Republic turned to Moscow after relations with France collapsed. And once security cooperation begins, trust must follow. That trust opened economic doors. Russian companies gained access to mining, energy, and nuclear discussion. Russian companies signed agreements on nuclear energy cooperation with countries like Egypt and Rwanda. Russia firms expanded mining interests in gold and uranium. While Russia trade in Africa remains smaller than China or Europe, its influence is strategic. So security ties often shape political loyalty. Political loyalty influences business decisions as well. One of the less obvious reasons French companies started losing contracts in Africa is tied to its history. For decades, France's influence in Africa was unquestionable. People remember the colonial period, not just the politics but economic control. Even generations later, that memory affects decision. So French companies often carry that weight without realizing it. In countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, protests against French military presence and economic influence became louder in recent years. Social media amplified these voices. Government faced pressure, as choosing a French contractor could trigger public dissatisfaction. Leaders had to balance technical efficiency against domestic perception. So this historical baggage also shaped trust. China, Turkey, and Russia had no colonial legacy in these countries. They arrived as outsiders willing to invest without past obligation. So that neutrality made negotiations simpler. Government could accept deals without worrying about public backlash for favoring a former colonizer. So colonial history also affected politics. France sometimes, linked contract to broader foreign policies expectation. For instance, sometimes French companies refuse to work in countries that have criticized them before. So this made France seem politically selective, while the competitors approach each country more pragmatically. So African governments started seeing French companies not just as business partners, but as extension of a foreign policy agenda. The impact was very real. Even when French firms offered technical expertise or financing, political memory affected outcomes. Contract previously assumed to be guaranteed could suddenly go to non-French companies. In today's Africa, reputation alone is not enough. Historical context shapes business decisions as much as budget or technical skills. Another key reason French firms lost ground is the rise of local participation. African governments increasingly prioritize partnerships that build domestic capacity. They want companies that train local workers, transfer knowledge, and involve African businesses in decision making. So this was less common with traditional French contracts, which often kept control centralized. China and Turkey quickly adapted to this expectation. Chinese firms, for example, hire local workers for most construction projects, from railways in Kenya to ports in Ghana. They also involve local suppliers for materials when possible. Turkey follows a similar approach in housing and hospital projects. This strengthens local economies and makes government more willing to award more contracts to them. Local participation also affects public perception. Citizens see jobs created and skills developed, which increase support for projects. Government measured success not only in completed infrastructure, but also in local economic impact. French firms sometimes appear to prioritize profit flowing abroad over African workforce development. So this shift matters more than numbers alone. Contracts increasingly reward collaborations, not just technical capability. African business leaders also influence government decisions. Governments are listening more to local stakeholders who often prefer partners that are willing to share knowledge and revenue at the same time. Foreign companies that act as outsiders lose ground, while those who act as collaborators succeed. French companies did not disappear from Africa by accident. Many attempted to adjust. Some offered revised financing options. Others increased local hiring. A few developed joint venture with African companies, but adaptation came slowly. By the time France reacted, competitors were already expanding their network. Chinese companies had completed large infrastructure projects. Turkish firms had built strong personal relationships with government. Russia had secured strategic security agreements. The window for easy dominance had closed. Timing matters in business. Once a government had positive experience with another partner, trust shifts without delay. Even a technically superior French bid might not win. Do you know why? Because the relationship with the government has weakened already. So, contracts that all seemed automatic now require negotiations and persuasion. The slow response also reflects structural changes. French companies operate under European regulation that limit flexibility. Changing hiring practices, financing model or partnership structure is complex and time-consuming. Competitors with more adaptable models, exploited this gap quickly. As a result, France lost contracts in sectors, ranging from energy to transport to telecommunication. Even major projects like ports or highways, once assumed to go to French firms, are now regularly awarded to Chinese, Turkish, or Russian competitors. Today, Africa is no longer limited to one or two traditional partners. Government will base, compare alternatives, and select the option that best fits technical needs, budget, and political priorities. This is a sign of growing confidence and strategic thinking. China offers speed and bundled financing. Turkey provided flexibility, personal engagement, and local job creation. Russia delivers security support and access to strategic resources. France offers experience and technical quality, but that is no longer enough to guarantee contract. African leaders are no longer accepting the default option. They are creating competition. This benefits Africa by pushing price down, increasing efficiency, and ensuring local involvement. Ordinary citizens may not always see every negotiation, but the effects are tangible. There are more jobs, faster infrastructure, and more influence over national projects, which is very important. So for French companies, the lesson is clear. Past dominance cannot replace adaptability. Africa is asserting its voice. It will choose partners based on results, not historical ties. This is not rejection, it is evolution. This is a sign of a continent, taking control of its economic destiny. The story ends with a broader insight. African geopolitics is changing. Contracts are not just business deals, they are a reflection of trust, capability, and choice. Understanding this is a key to seeing how Africa will shape its future, in a multipolar world.